Okay, right. I'll share the screen and we'll get cracking. So here we are. Anglo Saxon Astronomy.
One more thing before you start,
Yes.
Martin. I think you told me you would prefer to take questions at the end rather than during your talk.
Yes, if that's possible.
Yeah, I think absolutely.
Yeah, if that's okay. And when you mentioned Andrew, if that's Andy Green, who I know down in was it Cambridge, yeah, he'll be doing something for NASA or something to do with space flight. So he's a very busy fella. Now, Anglo-Saxon astronomy. Now, I was asked to do a presentation on Anglo-Saxon astronomy about 7 years ago, 6 years ago, by the University of York. They were doing some various projects at the university, and they were doing work on Anglo-Saxons. And I said, because of my time at the Yorkshire Museum, could I do anything on Anglo-Saxon astronomy? So I thought, well, okay, we'll do some digging around. My word, this is going to be one of the most complicated talks you've probably ever heard of without being mathematical, because we're going to look at a period of time that covers around about 1,000 years. And it's not just going to be Anglo-Saxon astronomy involved in this, because although that is the topic, they are going to inherit the Celtic astronomy that was here before the Romans arrived. The Romans, of course, bring in Greek astronomy. And then when the Saxons are here, you've also got Viking astronomy. So if the West Didsbury Astronomical Society, or I should mention, on my radio show, I do give plugs for all the astronomical societies in the north of England. I always give West Didsbury a plug when you've got a meeting coming up. All the various groups across the north of England. So my next show is going to be next Monday. So if you've got a talk coming up or something after that, it'll get a plug anyway. So we've got this combination of Celtic, Romano-Greek, pure Saxon, and Viking astronomy. So if the West Didsbury Astronomical Society was around sort of circa 1,200 years ago, and you walked into a bookshop looking for an astronomy book, you would really have some issues on your hands, some real problems. Did you buy the Celtic version, the Greek version, the Saxon version, or the Viking version, or maybe some combination? But this is the story. So if you bear all that in mind, here we go. Now, let's see, let's just get things cracking. Okay, well, Andrew was telling us about the stars we can see in the sky now, and it'll be pretty well the same going back to the times of the Anglo-Saxon period. Orion would be there. We can see there's Orion's belt, which was referring to as Sirius, and Betelgeuse, and the rest of them. They're all there. Now, it's always difficult to know where to start a story, and the great temptation is to start it here with Stonehenge, except it's actually around long before the Celts came here, and that's a completely different story. That's around about maybe 4.5, maybe even 5,000 years old. So that's well beyond the period that we're talking about. But I need to introduce you to Celtic astronomy, because Celtic astronomy would have been used by the Romans and the Saxons, and also it merged in with the Viking astronomy later on. It's good fun, but it's really complicated. Anyway, the Celts are going to get to Britain sort of circa, about sort of 2,000 years ago, and most of the records sort of suggest it's about sort of 100 BCE. Now, BCE is before the Common Era. Now, we normally use AD and BC, but sometimes people get a little bit upset by that. So the other convention is to use BCE, which is before the Common Era, and CE, which is the Common Era, which is old sort of BC and AD. Anyway, so the Celts come here around about just over 2,000 years ago. Now, one of the first things you discover about Celtic astronomy is that they have this enormous constellation, which is called Hu Gadarn. And it's a constellation that effectively covers the sky between Arcturus and Bootes on one side of the sky, and Capella and Auriga on the other side of the sky. And plumb in the middle is the Plough, or as our American friends like to call it, the Big Dipper. But we have the Plough. Now, Hu Gadarn is some individual who apparently, according to Celtic ideas and myths, invents, was the first man to link oxen to a plough. And the suggestion is that these 7 stars that form the plough, the name is an old Celtic name, and it's part of this massive great constellation of Hugadon. Effectively, it's an asterism within this constellation. So that is a suggestion as to where the name of the plough comes from. Now, of course, if we were to push forward 500 or 600 years, the Saxons would also be aware of this because of the traditions that they would come across when they entered Britain. Now, other things that were around in the Celtic period, we were talking about Orion, and as far as Orion's concerned, to the Celts, it will become Mabon. And Mabon it's a deity of the winter sun, and it's the only god who can handle a hunting dog, and that hunting dog is called Drudwyn, which we would know today, of course, as Sirius the dog star. So again, this would be a Celtic view on the night sky. And there are some interesting bits and bobs that we just come across over the next few minutes that you may well be sort of you'd be aware of. Perseus is the great hero who kills Medusa in Greek mythology, but to the Celts, it becomes Lu. It's a sun god who dies as the nights get shorter after sunset. This is obviously the summer solstice. And the traditional feast in his honor is called Lu Hashha, or Lammas Day, which is on the 1st of August, which, if there's any Yorkies listen to this, you'll know is Yorkshire Day. Now, although I live in Yorkshire, or very, very close to Yorkshire, right on the border, and my wife comes from Yorkshire, I don't come from Yorkshire, because you can tell by the voice. Now, Lu is also known as Co-re-ben, or cock robin. This is a leftover from the belief that the souls of people became birds after death. Again, it's an old Celtic idea. And of course, the old folk song, Who Killed Cock Robin? So again, and it's fascinating, when you start digging into these old myths and legends, how astronomy always laps through it, and it really is. And I know from doing loads of cross-disciplinary research that it's absolutely fascinating how you can take astronomy and you can pretty well put it into almost any area of life, and it's usually there somewhere. Another one of the gods that or constellations in the sky would be the constellation of Llŷ, which is Pegasus to us, and was a wonderful sea god. It was a wonderful white beast, and it figures in many, many Celtic legends. And it still has marine associations, because what do we call the white caps of waves when we're down at the seaside? We call them white horses, don't we? And it is this wonderful white horse that the Celts would refer to as Llŷ. And there's suspicions that it could well have been linked in with the story with sort of Lady Godiva and the white horse there. And also there's possibility that the white horse at Uffington in Oxfordshire, which is again is going to be really, really old, is perhaps linked in with this sort of Celtic mythology. And also I should mention that you've got Epona, which is modern day Andromeda, and Epona is this wonderful sort of goddess who rides on the back of this wonderful sea god. And we also can look at another winter constellation, and this is Gemini to us, but it's not seen as twins, but as two men battling for a woman, and they are Gwyn and Gwythyr, and they're the sons of someone called Grydal. Now he seeks the hand of the lady in red, which is Crwyd. Sorry, my wife worked out how to pronounce some of these words, and I do have to write some of these Celtic words down because Crwyd. And in Celtic mythology, red is seen. Ladies who have red are seen as expressing their purity. whereas I know that today you get red light districts and all this sort of thing, but in Celtic times, it was seen as a completely different thing. And in Celtic tradition, these two brothers, which are known as the rivals of May and interpreted as being the light and the dark halves of the year, they're battling out as they set at midnight on the 1st of May. And the Celtic feast of Beltane is featured there. And it's halfway between the spring and the summer equinoxes. Now, if you look at the stars, if you're okay with the Greek alphabet, you've got Mu and Eta there. They are both red giant stars. Now, the two brothers are chasing this woman in red. Not quite sure if it's referring to Mu or to Eta, but that's what that. So this is a little bit of Celtic mythology that I managed to dig up. But this say the Saxons would have been aware of this, because don't forget, although the Celts came over from what was sort of modern day sort of Belgium, Holland area, they would have had associations with the northern Germanic tribes as well. So a lot of these legends and myths would all be really interlinked. Now, the Romans come over in 43 AD, and they're here to about 410 AD or CE, and they bring the Greek ideas with them, because don't forget, they've conquered Greece, and they just simply use the Greek ideas and the Greek constellations, the Greek myths and legends. So the constellations that we're familiar with today, well, they to them that would be quite normal. So they would come over here. So you've now got a situation whereby for 400, well, perhaps not 400, but several hundred years, you've got Celtic mythology, Celtic star patterns, Celtic constellations, and then now the people living it are going to be introduced to the Greek constellations, and constellations like this, the Clash of the Titans and all the constellations that you would be involved in now. Now, also, of course, they would bring across other things with them, because the ancient Greeks, great scientists, great philosophers, although you've got to be a little bit careful when you look at the idea that they are sort of super scientists. What they've done is they've essentially inherited a lot of information that was made before they came around, and they just happened to sort of develop that and exploit that. People like Aristotle and Aristophanes, the guy who sort of works out how big the Earth is, and Aristotle with all of his lots of ideas. But there's a great suspicion that they didn't sort of suddenly in 600 BCE suddenly go, we know the answer to everything. They've inherited lots of things, and there's things like the Muller pin tables, which are Babylonian, which go back to at least 1000 BCE, and they have information about the sun, moon, stars, and all sorts of things. So they probably managed to get hold of that. The Romans also would bring clocks with them as well, clepsydra or water clocks. Now, whether there was any sort of way of measuring time before the Romans, no idea. Need to speak to archaeologists about that. But they would bring across candle clocks and water clocks as well. Now, the Romans, what they often try and do is, yes, they bring their own gods, their own legends, their own ideas, but they will often try and use what is already here, or whichever part of the empire they're in, so as they don't upset too many people. And I came across this. I'm afraid the words just slipped out a little bit for some reason. And the Romans built Watling Street, which goes from Kent right across to Shropshire. That's where it goes across there. Now, if you look on a map, that actually would follow the same path as the Milky Way goes across the sky. And again, if you look at Celtic mythology, the Celts believed that this area here, which the Romans call Watling Street, was Wheatlingar Street, which is a path that the giant sons of King Vaitla, they walked down. And there is this great suspicion that all the Romans have done is simply, with their route, the route's been named in deference or honor the fact that you've got this Celtic, or may even be Saxon connection with the Milky Way, because the Celts and the Saxons all call the Milky Way Waitlingar Street. So that is one of their names for the Milky Way. And so the suspicion is that they're actually bringing the Milky Way down onto Earth. And I came across this purely by chance when I was doing some research on this, and I came across a fellow called Roger of Hoveden, which is Howden in the East Riding of Yorkshire in modern day term, and he was a monk, and he wrote sort of in about the year 1190 about this connection. And certainly if you're looking at anywhere from sort of 500 through to about sort of 1300, 1400, monasteries are places to go to tease out bits of information, because they were obviously the places of the learning. They had the big libraries, and that's where those sort of people were. So could it be that the Celts and possibly a little bit of Saxon involvement, they see the Milky Way on the ground, this route that these giant heroes have walked, and the Romans build their road across Britain. They build Watling Street, but they call it Watling Street in honor of what the Celts and the Saxons think, what they call the Milky Way. The Romans are going to be sort of going back about 410. There's loads and loads of raids by people, the Saxons, the Angles, and the Picts. Now they all start coming in. There's all sorts of problems in the Roman Empire. So effectively, the Romans go home, and Britain is pretty well left fairly undefended. So the Saxons, they don't invade so much. They just sort of come across and just sort of merge in with the people who are living there. So what you've now got in Britain, you've now gone from a Celtic night sky to a Greek night sky, where you're now going to introduce a Saxon night sky. You see what I said right at the beginning, how complicated this really becomes. Now, we've looked at the plough already, and the Saxons called it Ermine's Wagen. Ermine was chief god of the Saxons, and lots of different civilizations do see the plough as a wagon. So there's nothing desperately different about that. So many people, the Chinese, they see it as a horse and cart. The Vikings see it as Odin's cart or Odin's wagon. So lots and lots of civilizations do see this particular group of stars, not necessarily as a plough, but as a wagon. Now, the Saxons, as well as most northern European civilizations, when it comes to the Polaris or the North Star, they refer to it as Sip Stiora, which means the ship star, because it was a very, very important star for navigating by. And obviously they would refer to that. Although, of course, the position of the North Star does change because of precession, it was still sort of close enough for them, all those hundreds of years ago, to be able to basically use it as a rough guide to where North is. So the Saxons, they now bring over lots and lots of their ideas. And one of their ideas is that the Milky Way, and in fact, it's not a definitely good picture, but the Milky Way is running down here beside Orion, and they call it Iringe, and I'm not even going to try and pronounce the other one, but it's another old Saxon name for the Milky Way. And what they see, there is, you'll see the dark lines in the Milky Way there, but what the Saxons see this as two streams of the Milky Way is saliva falling from the jaws of the two wolves called Wan and Will. So wolves are very, very important in northern sort of Germanic mythology and civilization. So that's how they see the Milky Way. Now, some friends of mine do lots of research into cometary impacts, not just on Earth, but in the solar system. And I was put onto this fellow. I'd never heard of this fellow, who I'm going to show you in a minute. I've got a real soft spot for him now. It's that fellow called Saint Gildas. He's another monk. and he's going to live between circa 500 to 570. And certainly from an ecclesiastical point of view, he's very, very important because he writes early history of the English church, sort of in the 500s. But in other areas, until about 20 years ago, he was seen to be as nutty as a fruitcake, because he was talking, and he mentions the year 536. He talks about the fire and brimstone being thrown down by God, destroying all the wickedness that was around and completely changing the scape of the earth. And most people are just sort of seeing it as being absolutely, well, he's just as nutty as a fruitcake. And it was until you get people from different disciplines start looking at things, because he is a monk, he is a very intelligent individual, but he's not a scientist. And he's got no scientific words. He can only use church words. He can only use monastic words to try and describe something. And what he's describing is a nuclear winter. And how do we know that? Well, because people started working with dendrochronologists. These are people who study tree rings. And between 536 and 548, tree ring growth across the northern hemisphere stops. Something has happened. Now, yes, it could well be volcanic activity, but it's also quite likely to be some sort of comet impact or asteroid impact. Now, this guy isn't a Saxon, but he's living at the Saxon time. And this is another monk, this is Michael the Syrian, and he tells us that in 536, the sun was dark, and its darkness lasted for 18 months, and the light was very feeble. Fruits didn't ripen, and the wine tasted like sour grapes. So clearly something has happened. Gildas has seen something. He's actually observed it. He's witnessed it. And he's trying to describe it in his own unscientific way. And effectively, what he's describing is a Tunguska event. Now, we know 1908, an object about 50 meters across airbursted above the Tunguska River in northern Siberia, and it destroyed something in the region of around about 80 million trees over a 700 or 800 square mile area of forest land. And this is obviously an artist's impression of what they think it may have looked like. Now, interestingly enough, whatever this thing was that hit, it obviously was very, very close to Britain and Western Europe, because at a place called the Isle of Axholme, which is in Lincolnshire, in the late 1600s, they would drain the fenland so they can use it for farming purposes. And about a yard under the ground, what they found was rows and rows and rows of trees, all just blown over in exactly the same way that we have the trees blown over here in Siberia. So, Gildas, by the looks of it, he's given us an on-the-spot report of what's happened when something has come in and airbursted. And then when you start talking to archaeologists about this time, there's mass migration across Europe, big tribes moving around. They're looking for food. They're looking for areas where they can grow their crops. So there's a massive shortage. So there does seem to be something quite serious happened in 536. Now, I've been mentioning the monasteries, and St. Augustine comes over in 597, and Christianity is now becoming sort of, really sort of quite important in Britain. Because the monks are going to be using the Greek ideas for astronomy, and in particular Aristotle's ideas. And because the idea is that, well, the Earth is at the center of everything, and everything rotates around the Earth because the Earth is stationary. It's very, very important. And the monasteries, they kind of adopt this idea. Now, this is going to prove to be massively important when we go through to the Middle Ages with Copernicus and all these sort of characters, when there are these big arguments about, do you put the Earth in the center of the system, or do you put the sun in the center of the system? But the monasteries adopt the Aristotle system, and don't forget, the monasteries are now becoming more and more powerful. Now, I know they always set off to be purely religious places, but because they attracted the cleverest people, and rich people made massive donations to them, they became bigger and bigger and more powerful. And you know the old saying that well, knowledge is power, and they had the power, so they are now pushing this idea. Now, astronomers, even Ptolemy, in the was it 150, 160 CE, this idea that everything moves around in perfect circles, even he knew that wasn't right. So they introduced what they call these epicycles. So you have objects. There's the Earth in the center. You have objects moving around the sun in circles, but the only way you can get them to it is to have little circles upon their circle, these epicycles. And this idea wouldn't be changed until the time of, but even after Copernicus, they were still arguing about whether they're or not. But this is what the monks said was happening. Now, other things that happened during the Anglo Saxon period, if there are any people from Yorkshire listening to this presentation now, and if you think to yourself, why is it that each year when we want our Easter eggs, we have to wait for a different day and sometimes even a different month? Well, you can blame the event which happened in 664 at Whitby. That was the synod of Whitby in 664, when the various churches were trying to work out when to have Easter, when to celebrate Easter, and they decided it would end up being the first Sunday after the first full moon following the northern spring equinox. So that's how Easter is actually defined now. And in fact, if you look at monastic records going back, perhaps not to 600, but certainly to the 800s, that's when you get the names of these various moons being used. So Easter is defined as there on your screen, and that was come about in 664 by the Synod of Whitby. Now, I've mentioned how important monasteries were, not just in religious purposes, but scientific as well. And I want to introduce to you now two really important monks, the Venerable Bede and Alcuin. They are both giants, really, in their own sort of way. Bede comes from the northeast. Like many people, we know very little about his background, but again, he writes massive volumes about the history of England, and a lot of the stuff we use today is actually based on the work that he did. He not only wrote on England, obviously on the Bible, nature, music, and poetry. And you can see the years he lived between. And Alcuin, perhaps one of the most famous scholars of the late 8th century. He was educated at the Cathedral School in York. Now, whether he was born in York or not, no one's quite sure. He's born in Northumbria. York was in Northumbria at the time, so we can't be too. We're not quite sure. Anyway, some of the things that these contributed to astronomy. Bede seems to be the first person to write down a connection between the positions of the full moon and tides, and he notices that when the moon's full or new, you get a high tide, and this then simply meant that he was able to do this correlation between when the tides were going to be high and high tides were going to be low. And until the 1200s, if you were a captain of a ship sailing around the British Isles or going slightly further afield and you wanted tide times, you actually went to monasteries. There was no Coast Guard to do. You went to monasteries, and they wouldn't give you the tide times for wherever you look at. They would sell tide times to you. Again, another way of just making their money. Mention Alcuin. Alcuin, I say, very important, and he traveled across to Rome to meet the Pope. And as he's ambling on his way back, he just happens to bump into this fellow called Charlemagne, who's the emperor of the Carolingian Empire. And although he was obviously quite a fierce fighter, he had loads of wars he was fighting against numerous peoples, he was actually really, really keen on astronomy. He worked and when he met Alcuin, and they got talking, and Alcuin says to Charlemagne, listen, I know you're really keen on astronomy. And Charlemagne was interested in the positions of the planets in the sky, how you can work out where they're going to be, how you can predict eclipses and that. So he really was dead keen on astronomy. So Alcuin says to him, well, look, I tell you what, how about, because you're getting this fabulous wealth and knowledge and information, just like the monasteries are back in England. How about building a big palace with a big library, which is what Charlemagne did. He built his massive great palace at Aachen, and it really was an incredible place for knowledge to be gathered at a time which is often referred to as like the Dark Ages. You know, we're in this time of Saxon England, Saxon Europe, and this great library. And because of that library, we, almost by chance, Alcuin comes across these. These are the Leiden Aratea plates, and they were produced by a Greek philosopher, sort of circa 270, 260 BCE. And Alcuin and Charlemagne get hold of a copy of these drawings, these pictures. There were originally 99 of them, but the records tell us that 4 got lost before 1600. And their artistic views of the constellations, they're not supposed to be specific interpretations of what the constellation is with the stars all in exactly the right place. But my word, you can see the images which we see on modern day star charts with Pegasus and Cassiopeia and Perseus. And without these, and these were preserved, they were put into the great library at Aachen. And in actual fact, they were copied and placed there, but actually they were placed in the library just after the death of both Alcuin and Charlemagne as well. But they stayed there, they survived there, and it was because of the funding of Charlemagne, which meant that they survived, and we now know what the ancient Greek constellations look like because they are based on these pictures. And it was all down to an Anglo Saxon monk who happened to bump into one of the most important emperors in Europe, and they came across these pictures that we have today. Now, at this time, as the Anglo-Saxon period carries on, we start coming across our Viking friends. Now, the Vikings, well, you know all the stories about them. They were pretty, they were no more barbaric than anybody else because it was a pretty tough time to be living. Now, so just to recap what you got in Saxon, you know, don't forget this is the West Didsbury Astronomical Society, you know, sort of circa 800. You've got your Celtic astronomy, your Celtic star charts, you've got your Greek star charts, you've got your own Saxon star charts. Well, now you're going to get some Viking star charts to go with it as well. And we've got the North Star. We're all quite happy with where the North Star is. But in fact, if you turn the clock back to about 900, the North Star was actually this one here, which is it's a double star, Struve 1694 or 32H Camelopardalis from the Hevelius catalogue. So it was slightly off from where the North Star is today as regards their North. So they had to make a little tiny allowance for things. But again, the Vikings called this star the Skipstjora, or the ship star. As I said early on, that is a very, very common term that's used throughout northern tribes and northern civilizations in Europe. Now, I've mentioned the fact that that was the North Star there, and today the North Star's here. Well, it's because of this thing called precession. The Earth is wobbling on its axis very, very slightly, and like a spinning top on a table. And whereas a spinning top takes just a fraction of a second to spin around once, the Earth takes about 26,500 years to wobble once. But if you did stand on the North Pole of the Earth for about 26,000 years or so, you'd find that at different times there'll be different North Stars. So we've got Polaris at the moment. We had Thuban in the constellation of Draco the Dragon at the time of the Great Pyramids. And if we project right forward to about the year 14,000, the star Vega in the constellation of Lyra would actually be the closest star to the North Star. we had all these ideas about what the Milky Way was. It's this giant sort of road going across Britain, or it's this wolf, dribbling. Well, the Vikings have another version of the Milky Way. They class it as the tree of Yggdrasil, and it's the tree of life. And there are three areas. There's Asgard, where the gods live, Midgard, where people live, and Hell, where you can work out yourself there. And the Milky Way is in fact the inside skull of a mighty warrior called Ymir, who was killed in the early days of the formation of Viking mythology. And it's the inside of the skull, and it's held up by four little dwarfs called Nordi, Surdi, Austria, and Westry, which of course is where we get our points of the compass from, north, south, east, and west. Interesting enough, in Viking mythology, they look at Orion differently to most other civilizations, because they see it not as a male figure, but as a female figure. They see it as goddess Frigg. And goddess Frigg is Mother Earth. Now, this is a Victorian interpretation, because she's got the horns on her head there. But Frigg, Mother Earth, is married to Odin, and they saw Orion's belt and sword as the distaff and the spindle that Frigg used to make linen cloth for flax. And Orion belt and the sword with the spindle and distaff, the spinning clouds, suggests that maybe the Vikings could see the Orion Nebula, Messier 42. Now, if that is the case, and I can't prove this, but the fact that you've got this idea of the goddess Frigg, she's spinning this material, and you're going to get lumps of material form. If they could see the Orion Nebula, well, they're predating the fact that the Greeks don't mention the Orion Nebula, nor do the Arabs. So, is this a bit of a red herring, or did they really see it there and they report it and others didn't? Or maybe it was reported by others, but it just hasn't survived. The first recording we have from Western Europe of the Orion Nebula is not until year 1611. And just staying with this idea of all this material being produced by the goddess Frigg. In fact, Andrew showed an interesting picture, and it's just what I'm going to talk about now, which is the Barnard Loop, which is the remains of a supernova which went bang about 2 million years ago. It's called the Barnard Loop because Edward Barnard photographed it in 1894. Could it be that they could see that wispy gas in the sky? Don't forget, light pollution would be minimal for people living 1,200 years ago. I'm not quite sure whether people even today can see it or not. I don't know, but it does get extensively photographed. Now, I can't give you a Celtic, so I haven't found one yet, but there may be one. I can't give you a Celtic zodiac or even a Saxon zodiac, but I can give you a Viking zodiac. But there appear to be 9 signs in the Viking zodiac. So depending on what your star sign is, you can see that Sagittarian becomes a Udale, and Taurian becomes a Folk Bang, but there's no reference to Cancer, Leo, or Aquarius. And just briefly to mention that also they had their own special names. And I've got some more scientific papers to go through, which are often published by archaeologists. And you've got to sort of really sift through them, because I'm trying to find out what I can get the names that the Saxons would have used for the planets as well. But they are the Viking names of the planets that they would have seen. Now, comets are something which occur in the sky. The ancient Chinese referred to them as hairy stars, and we know that Chinese records are really, really useful going back several thousand years, because although they were produced for astrological reasons, they were reports of astronomical events. And the Vikings tell us of something called the Staff of Gungnir. And I couldn't find any reference to what Gungnir might be. But it appears that Gungnir is some mythical weapon that Odin had and he would throw it at a target. It would hit the target and then come back to him again. And well, what do comets do? Well, comets travel across the sky and then they reappear again. And during Saxon times, Halley's comet, for example, would be seen in 451, 837, and 912. Now, I'm not saying for 1 minute that they are saying that Halley's comet was Gungnir. Maybe any comet which appeared in the sky could well have been called Gungnir. But it's just interesting. And also, there was a link with Lord of the Rings, apparently, according to Honourable Number One Son, because apparently that's a term that's used in the Lord of the Rings as well, with some mythical weapon there as well. And again, from what I'm told, quite a lot of Lord of the Rings is based on the Viking mythology. Now, I mentioned the monasteries are these great centers of learning. They're building up, they're getting bigger and bigger and bigger. They sort of start, well, trying to get more information. Now, one of the ways they can get information is by spreading out. And we know, for example, the Vikings and probably some Saxons as well formed part of the Varangian Guard, which is the bodyguard to the Byzantium emperors in from about 800 to about 1100. Now, we know that the Byzantium Empire is bumping up against the Arab Empire, and with your astronomical history, you'll know that with the rise of Islam in the 600s, suddenly astronomy becomes really big in the Middle East. Places like Baghdad and Damascus become the centers of learning for astronomical knowledge. And they're going to be producing loads and loads of books, loads and loads of information. Lots of really good astronomers come from there as well. And in fact, when you read reports of when the first Crusaders got to the Middle East, the Arab astronomers couldn't realize how thick the European people were, because they sort of knew nothing. But with all this knowledge within the Arab world and also within the Byzantium world, now we think about the World Wide Web today. Really, really good way of getting information around. Yeah, but it was actually going on over 1,000 years ago. Although it wasn't the World Wide Web, it was the monastic wide web, because information would have been sent or monks would have traveled across Europe down to the Byzantium and the Arab Empire, and they would have gone back with information that was totally unknown in Western Europe and in Britain. And of course, it will go to monasteries. It will provide more information in monasteries, which gives monasteries more power, more knowledge, more power. It's just this repeating cycle is going. And we know that loads of astronomical books were being transferred around. Perhaps not quite, but I can't speak during the 900s, but I know when I was in York, there were archaeologists and historians showing that in the 1300s, there were literally dozens and dozens of astronomical volumes coming to York from the Middle East. So you can probably assume they were coming in much earlier than that as well. The monks, of course, did observe the sky because they had to work out where certain astronomical bodies were in the sky. And what they did in their diaries, they wrote things in red ink. And that was particularly important feast days. And if you ever heard the term before, today's a red letter day, meaning it's a very important day, well, it's a monastic term that goes back about 1,200 years, because that's what they thought that the red signified. It was an important feast day, and we simply use that term today. Interesting enough, little theory of mine on this regarding blue moons. It may well be that a blue moon, which is the 13th full moon in a year, could well actually be written in a monastic diary in blue rather than red. And I did do quite a lot of work in the York Minster archives there. I didn't find anything, and I think they had a nice sort of little PhD project for someone to go over to the Vatican Library, spend numerous years going through whatever monastic libraries of monastic journals have survived, and just see whether you can find a year where there were 13 full moons, and just see whether it's actually noted in blue. It's an idea. The monks would have used things like diopter to observe the positions of the stars. That would be used by the ancient Greeks, but they would have been using things like that. But things like astrolabes, they didn't come into use until later in the Middle Ages. So you often hear little sort of stories about the monks using them. They didn't, they couldn't because they weren't around. Now, I mentioned the Venerable Bede, and one really important piece or source of information is the Anglo Saxon Chronicles. If you ever get a chance to sort of thumb through it, it covers just over 600 years of English history. And as you can see on the screen there, you've got 8 solar eclipses, 11 lunar eclipses, and the rest of them are all mentioned in the Anglo Saxon Chronicles. But, and this is where the but comes in, you've got to be a little bit careful, because in the last maybe sort of 5 years or so, people actually gone through it far more carefully than people did maybe 20 years ago. And some of the information that's provided in there actually is wrong. And to give you an example, this is Bede has written this, and it's recorded in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle that the eclipses, there were solar eclipses visible in England in 538 and 540, when in fact they weren't visible in Britain. So what's going on? Well, is it possible, and this is more likely what's happened, Bede has got, because don't forget, Bede's writing sometime after this. He's writing, you know, well over, was it, sort of, yeah, maybe 70, 80 years after this. He gets garbled reports of darkened skies over England, or something to that effect. Now, a darkened sky, now he knows a darkened sky in the daytime is an eclipse. So therefore, if he's got these reports of 538 and 540 of this darkened sky, well, it must be eclipses of the sun. So he has simply put it down, and it's been transcribed over the years. And it comes through in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicles that there are eclipses of the sun in 538 and 540. They plainly were not visible from Britain. They were visible from other parts of the world, but not from Britain. So what's going on? Well, remember Gildas, remember this nuclear winter, remember the skies become dark and it's not easy to see things. Is Bede being fooled, tricked, if you like, into thinking that these dark skies that he's reading about are not eclipses, but really a darkening of the sky caused by something thumping into the earth in the 530s? Well, it's certainly, it's an interesting conundrum, because that's what it really does suggest. And there are some other eclipses which aren't mentioned in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicles. The eclipses of 758, 968, and 1023, they're not mentioned. Now, of course, it's possible that it could well be cloudy. It may not have been seen. And also, of course, this may also indicate that a lot of the astronomical knowledge, working out things, wasn't perhaps so good in Britain as it was perhaps in the Middle East. Now, we know that the eclipse of January 24th, 1023, that was actually observed in Belgium. So we know that because we got reports from monasteries there regarding that. So we know that for sure. But as regards the totality area, we got no information on that at all, certainly according to the Anglo-Saxon Chronicles. Researchers discovered in 2012 that the Earth was hit by a massive blast of radiation between 774 and 775. Now, luckily for the Anglo-Saxons, they didn't have any computers at the time, because if they had, they'd have been zapped. There's been really massive levels of carbon-14 in trees and beryllium-10 in ice cores in Antarctica show that it looks like either 2 neutron stars or 2 black holes have merged somewhere in our galaxy, and they produced this massive burst of energy which hit the this massive burst of radiation which hit the Earth. But say, luckily for the Anglo-Saxons, it didn't bother them too much because their computers weren't that advanced, which is good for them. And the supernova of 1054, the Crab Nebula. And I'll defy anyone to say they can see a crab in that. What Lord Ross was doing when he said he thought he could see a crab there when he first drew it with the 72-inch telescope at Burke Castle, I have no idea. But not quite right about that. It's visible for months and months and months in the sky. And the current estimates was it reached about magnitude -12. And yet there is no reference to it. There's one minor reference from somewhere in Switzerland. There is no reference at all from Western Europe of this star which appears in the sky. It's reported in China. China gives a good description. It's a guest star, and we know it's observed there. As I say, it was actually visible for 2 years, and we got Chinese and Korean and Japanese reports, so we know that. But it's nothing from Western Europe, nothing from Britain, nothing from the Saxon period. Why? It doesn't make sense, or does it? Now, don't forget, monasteries are really, really powerful. I mean, we've got to really try and understand just how powerful they are. And they believe the heavens are perfect, the heavens are unchanging. So if a star suddenly appears in the sky and people from villages and towns see this star and go up to the monasteries and say, look at that bright star in the sky, the monks may well just turn around and say, what star are you looking at? And they say, that bright star there. There's no bright star there. There is, I can see it. There's nothing there. But can you? And then the monks may turn around and say, ah, this is the work of the devil. It's putting images into your eyes. You're thinking of stars there and it isn't. Now, the monasteries are so powerful that people are going to perhaps believe it. Now, whether any records were made in monasteries and they just haven't survived is unknown. But you would have thought at least one in Britain or Western Europe would have survived somewhere, but nothing has. So that may well be one reason why there are very, very few records, well, say nothing from Western Europe regarding the supernova of 1054. And the Anglo Saxon period is going to come to an end in 1066 with Halley's Comet in the sky again. Now, I know comets are often regarded as being bringers of doom and disaster. They certainly were for King Harold when William the Conqueror landed and the Battle of Hastings was fought. Now, this has been a fairly quick sort of 50-minute trawl through 1,000 years of history in Britain, or England in particular. And what I've tried to show here is this fusion of knowledge. Now, we in the West, we use essentially Greek mythology. If we're talking about the star patterns, if you go for a star party, you'll talk about Pegasus or Orion, and you'll relate the stories about the Greek mythology. You wouldn't give Chinese mythology regarding it or Egyptian mythology. You would just give the classical Greek mythology. But in England, during the Saxon period, you would have this massive conflict of interest, conflict of, is it Celtic constellations? Are they Greek constellations? Are they Saxon constellations? Are they Viking constellations? In fact, there'll be all of those. They'll all be running parallel with each other. And it must have been an incredibly complicated, I'll tell you what, pretty interesting time to be an astronomer and looking at the night sky. Okay, okay, folks, that's my story. I'm going to stop the share and I will do my level best to answer any questions that you might have. Thank you.
Jason, have the lights back.
I see somebody else has a problem with the cat as well. Yeah, our cat's, yeah, our cat has a habit of parking in front of the screen and then turning around so the head's facing me, and yeah, just expressing that. Yeah.
Martin, thank you for a fascinating talk, a very interesting talk covering a very, very long period in history from the times you discovered discussed. I found it very interesting. Would anyone like to throw open questions? Anyone in the audience here or anyone on Zoom? Hang on. Let me bring you the.
Hi, Martin.
Hiya.
Yeah, that was fascinating. Thank you very much. One of the things that was occurring to me at the beginning, which you sort of partly answered, was just whether there were any vestiges of the old constellations or anything astronomically related in the languages around now, and the north, south, east, and west thing was amazing. I didn't realize that's where it came from. Are there any of the sort of star names or anything else, or the constellations still in the older languages, the older Celtic languages, or have they pretty much been wiped out and
I've got to say, I don't know. My Celtic dictionary isn't very good. In fact, it's non-existent. But what it would be possible to do, if go online or Amazon or something like that, and see if you could find a Celtic dictionary, and to see whether there are star names that are still used today. I suspect the answer to that is yes, they probably are. And in fact, if you ever there's a really good book called Star Names, Their Lore and Meaning by Richard Hinckley Allen, which is essentially the standard reference book for constellations and stars around the world. You'll get the Japanese, the Chinese, you name it. So that's a really good book to go for. It's so difficult today to know what's what. With the mythology and the legends, they're often not quite so hard to get. What is hard to get is to get those pictures and put them in the sky. You often hear people talking about if I use Pegasus, Perseus, and Cassiopeia, that everyone knows that story. But equally, those characters are in the night sky. But when you talk about Celtic mythology or Saxon mythology, it's finding a reference that puts them into the sky. That is the difficult thing to do.
I can imagine. I mean, just to the point that it suddenly made me realize that, I mean, we think of the Romans, 2,000 years ago and something like that, but there were probably tens of thousands of years of names of constellations that have been completely forgotten about, of course, I suppose.
I'm sure you're right. I'm sure there are astronomical historians who are actually doing work on this. And in actual fact, a subject which 30 years ago, if you mentioned the word archaeoastronomy 30 years ago, you'd be laughed out of the court.
Yeah,
you really would. But now everyone recognizes that there is a real branch of astronomy and archaeology, and you get the two coming together. And I know from my own research work in the past, cross-disciplinary research really works, because if you're an astronomer, you're an astronomer. You're not an archaeologist. And an archaeologist isn't an astronomer. But when you put the two together, you get the strengths from both disciplines.
Yeah, that was astonishing with the sort of AD, what was it, 536, was it?
Yes, 536.
Yeah, I'd love to look into that a little bit more. Yeah, something I never thought about.
Please do. No one's quite sure what happened, but there's one of two ideas. One, there may well have been volcanic activity. There's always volcanic activity, but the suspicion is that the Earth got thumped by a Tunguska type event, and it's actually been reported by old Gildas.
Oh, it's astonishing. Thanks, Martin. I'll pass it over to somebody else, but that was great. Thank you.
Carolyn wants to go next because she had a hand up.
Hi, that was fascinating. Jim Al-Khalili is always talking about the importance of the Arab science before Islam kind of crushed it a bit. And we have a lot of Arab names for the stars, but what were their constellations? Were they the ones that the Greeks took over?
Effectively, the Arab astronomers, they tended to use the Greek constellations, but use Arabic names, broadly speaking. There are going to be Arabic versions of the constellations, but by convention, they just don't seem to be used very much. We just seem to use the classical Greek ones. But if you look at places like, in Baghdad, there was somewhere called the House of Wisdom, which was there 1100s, 1200s. And if they used to meet, like you guys meet, they met regularly. And if they come across someone who had a book that was belonging to the classical Greek period of science, they would say, if you give me the book, they'd put it on a set of scales, they'd weigh the book, and they would offer you that book, or they would offer you the weight of gold for that book. And I remember it must be about 15 years ago. And I was working with a couple of Syrian astronomers. I have no idea what happened to them. And that they were saying that, you know, nobody in the West really realizes just how much the Arab period of science put into Western knowledge. And any of you who can remember back at school, if you can remember things like algebra, well, anything starting AL, that's going to be Arabic. You know, and they give us the zero number, although I know they sort of pinched them from the Indians, but we tend to sort of say the Arabs do it. And also, of course, the numbers we use today are Arabic numbers rather than Roman numbers.
They also discovered circulation of the blood, far, far earlier than Harvey, who is always credited with discovering that.
Carolyn, that whole area of scientific history is fascinating. And if you can not make it too boring, because it's easy to make something boring, if you can sort of tease it out and relate it to modern day and tell some sort of story around it. What I try and do with my presentations is to tell lots of stories and just tuck a little bit of science in. And I find that sort of a combination tends to work fairly well.
Jim Al-Khalili wrote this book, Pathfinders.
Right.
I heard him give the talk. The talk was more interesting than the book because it was much more concise, but the book is very detoiled. But it is absolutely fascinating. So you're saying that the Arabs took the Greek ideas of constellations. I'd got it the wrong way around.
Yeah, they took the names, or they replaced the Greek names with Arabic names.
Yeah.
But essentially, they sort of seem to keep the same sort of patterns of stars.
Is Celtic language like Welsh? Because we have Welsh dictionaries here.
I think it might be. There might be a bit of a crossover there. Certainly, when you look at some of the names of some of these characters, they certainly are sort of Welsh sounding anyway.
Yeah, interesting. Thank you very much.
Martin, some astronomers here amongst us use planetary software like Stellarium to plan our observing sessions and imaging sessions. Yeah. But we're normally using them to go forward in time. If we put them in reverse, and we go backwards, how far back do we go accurately with them? Maybe Andrew might know the answer to that question. If that makes sense.
I think Heavens Above, which I've used, goes back, I think, about it's about 1,200 years, 1,500 years. I think fairly okay, as far as I know. Yeah. But so if you've got anyone who has got a really good program, that they'll know better than I.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. Would anyone else like to ask any more questions of Martin? We're getting to the there's Joginder's got his hand up on Zoom. Joginder?
Yeah, small couple little things. I just heard that decimal and zero, they were given from India.
Yes, that's right.
And if the Arab, they took it from India and they call it Hind Se. Hind means India and Se means from.
Right.
Besides that, the constellations, there are 12 constellations in Indian mythology, and they are mainly for the astrological thing rather than astronomical.
Right.
That's why the India lost quite a lot, but the good observation of the 12 constellation falls exactly with the constellation which we use in this country.
Right. I've got to say, I know virtually nothing about Indian astronomy simply because it's an area I just haven't gone into because I've just been so busy going into different areas of it's just little bits and pieces that I've just sort of pulled out. But it's fascinating how these things all sort of link together, and it is quite weird how sometimes you'll say with Vikings, for example, they have ideas from people from the Far East, and you think there must be loads and loads of cross-fertilization going on, lots of ideas. And the Arabs, as I say, taking all the credit, if you like, whereas they pinched the ideas from the Indian astronomy, but the Arabs seem to get all the credit for it.
Yeah, it was unfortunate that the Indian astronomy didn't go as far as should have, but the observation, they went more for the astrology because there was money in the astrology than as
yes, there's money. There's always money in astrology. There's no money in astronomy.
They could tell your future and change your future and whatnot.
You're quite right, my friend.
Yeah, thank you very much for interesting talk. Very nice.
You're right, kind, my friend. Thank you.
I think we can have time for one more question. Otherwise, I think we need to be packing up. In the Zoom talk can go on all night, but we have to be out of this room in 5 or 10 minutes. So we have time for one more question if anyone else would like to ask, or perhaps I should say, well, thank you very much to the people who've asked questions, but particularly Martin, thank you very, very much for an interesting talk covering a very interesting delivery of information covering a huge part of the history of our shores. That's put a lot of things in context for me that I never really had thought about particularly before. I'm very, very grateful to you for stepping in at short notice. Very grateful to the people in this room for being patient with us with you probably weren't aware, but the screen kept on flickering on and off. And then after that had settled down, the lights in the room started flickering on and off. So for those of us in this room, we've had a slightly disjointed evening, but maybe the people at home have had cats walking in front of their screens or whatever. But thank you to all for being patient with us. And I think we've managed to get through the evening and without losing the thread of your very interesting talk. So thank you very much. And I'd like to say thank you from us all in the normal way.
Thank you. It's very kind of you.